This is your second video on Junot Diaz, the brief, wondrous life of Oscar Wilde. I'm going to do this one as quickly as possible. I know you've got writing assignments this week, so for this video, since we already had an introduction to Diaz and Dominican history and a little bit about the first few chapters of the novel, I thought this week I would just sort of highlight some themes that you might want to pull out and make connections to other novels that we've read so far this semester, as well as find an entry point into your reading response for this week. Some of these things are going to be very specifically related to our class: immigration, diaspora, migration, refugee status, movement, displacement, and some of them are going to be very specific to Diaz and his particular viewpoint on living between the Dominican culture and the U.S. culture as he experienced when he was growing up. As I said last time in the last video, there are certainly elements in his writing that are referencing experiences from his own youth, and to deny, sort of autobiographical parts of the book is not correct, but also to just flat out say that this is a stand-in for the Diaz voice is also incorrect. So just know that going in. So I've got about 6 or 7 different theme areas that I want to highlight. Some of them are smaller, a little bit of them, a few of them are really, really specific. And a couple of them are larger, trying to create a bigger, broader area for you to maybe pour into a little bit. Hopefully by now you've finished the novel, or you're close to finishing the novel before you look at this video. So I'll try to speak in general terms if you haven't. As I mentioned in last week's video, a lot of people enjoy this novel on an entertainment basis, as well as for its educational and academic purposes. It's an enjoyable novel, so hopefully you've found that experience. If not, that's fine too. Let me know. I'd be interested to hear feedback on any of the books that we've read. So, okay, so let's start out with some of these themes that I've pulled out and that I want you to be able to see. The first idea that I've collected here is categorized under a topic of the individual as a component of a community, or as a component of a nation, or a larger group of people. And we've seen this before. The individual stands for the individual, yes, but it's also meant to sort of represent a larger portion of people by their own specific experience standing in for others' experiences. And so the experience that is most prominent here is that of the diaspora from the Dominican Republic, the generation of immigrant children and first-generation immigrants as well, who are awash in Dominican history and American or U.S. pop culture. And through this, we see experiences that Diaz and others who would have immigrated when they were young kids or in the middle part of the 20th century would have grown up with, and writing into that space, which is what Diaz does and what he has Junior do, is our way of seeing what that experience entails. And Junior, in fact, is our eyes. He takes us through this particular type of lifestyle, the very unique balance between American and Dominican, and also the sort of youthful, trendy, pop cultural things that are all enmeshed into this pocket of his existence. Junior is our way into that, and as the novel unfolds later into its culmination, we see a little bit more of why Junior has taken up that role as the speaker, as the writer, and as, not necessarily a guide or anything, but sort of the one who shows us or reveals. What's also interesting about diaspora studies, and as Diaz has highlighted here in his particular version of it, is we tend to see a contrast between those that are physically disconnected from a homeland, right? And we've seen it in other places this semester as well. So they're physically displaced for whatever reason from a homeland and a cultural touchstone, etc. And yet they still have a connection through other means. And that means might be a family member who tells them stories, something of a news source allowing them to know what's going on back home. A continued sort of merging of small cultural traits with other small new cultural traits, as well as large-scale ones, but small ones oftentimes are most apparent. Food and family values and those sort of things. Those are always going to be most apparent, and oftentimes they're played off for comedy value, but sometimes they indicate that there is a difference, there is a separation. And as I said, to sort of highlight this category, the nation or a group, a larger population, is sometimes represented in the individual. So Oscar and Junior and Lola and Belicia and Abelard, all of these characters, individually sort of manifest different parts of the national or larger group population of Dominican experience. This sort of leads into the next category, the next issue that I've outlined for us here, and I talked a little bit about this last time. Sadie, chill out. My wife's going to enter, so just relax, Sadie. But as I was saying, the outsider, the immigrant mentality that we see here. Lisa, I'm doing a video, hon. That's okay. The outsider immigrant depicted through Oscar, is obvious. We talked a little bit about this in last week's video. His nerdiness, his intelligence, his physical appearance, his lack of machismo, all of these sort of characterize him as an outsider in many different social circles, and this sort of parallels with the role of the immigrant outsider, which we've seen in a variety of roles throughout the semester, and we see Diaz again sort of continuing that narrative. And the immigrant, of course, one thing we've talked about at several points this semester is an outsider in their new home as well as in their homeland. We saw this really specifically in Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake, the idea that the homeland has sort of moved beyond them and their new homeland has not accepted them yet. So this sort of dual outsiderness is experienced by immigrants and passed on to second generation and third generation, etc. In this novel, Oscar's mother, Belicia, serves as this bridge between Dominican and U.S. geographic spaces, cultural spaces, and sort of memories and narratives. But her children feel the diaspora effects more prominently because Belicia, while traumatized and while dealing with this drama, is much more capable of, to an extent, of transporting herself back and forth, and we get as the novel goes along, we get more of her background and her story and who she is. So it's not as if she's got it easy, but the effects of diaspora are different between her and her children, and so both of them, in sort of combating this outsiderness, must approach it in different ways. The next theme I've sort of categorized into one area is a prominent one, and I talked a little bit about this in the video last time. The Dominican masculinity, or more generalized Latino male presentation, right? And as I mentioned in the video last time, sex is a key ingredient in the Dominican male persona that Diaz is exploring here, and Oscar's lack of any sort of game, as Diaz would say, is representative of his lack of Dominican masculinity, and he recognizes this. He knows this because he has learned and inherited this fact from being a young boy, and realizing that this is what Dominican males do, and if you do not, you are somehow incomplete or unworthy. And this drives a lot of the novel for him. And he in connection with that, he also lacks a tendency or a desire for violence, which is unique in this book. We see an awful lot of violence. In fact, that's one of my themes in a minute here. He lacks that sort of rush or pull towards violence, which again might sort of mark him as overly sensitive and anti-Dominican male, but in a lot of ways we might see that as a much more healthy version of masculinity. And so there's this idea that Oscar is pushing down some walls in order to create a better version of a Latino male, or just a man in general. Junior, on the other hand, is the epitome of the Dominican male, right? He's muscular, he's good looking, he's very sexual. He's described as being very, very popular, and has many girlfriends and many girls who he hooks up with throughout the novel. And he, along with Tio Rodolfo, who is also embodiment of Latino machismo and masculinity, are here for Oscar as teachers, as advice givers, in a way to sort of pull him along and to almost replicate their masculinity onto him, and help him achieve what he believes he wants to achieve, and what he's been told he needs to achieve in order to be more masculine. And of course Oscar continues to fail at this. He is largely how do I want to say, he's driven by this need to make himself much more acceptable as a male Latino or Dominican, but he continuously falls short. And that failure, along with the depression that becomes the result, drives him further and further downward, even as he grows and he gets more into the possibilities that college and writing open up for him. Those things still hold him down. Okay. On the flip side, you might look at the presence or the depiction of female sexuality and its relationship to power and how it's represented. And this, I thought, was a very interesting point to really begin to analyze if you wanted to look at femininity, feminism, depictions of females, the role of the female in the machismo culture, etc. There are some really fascinating elements in this novel that are more complicated, I think, than we might be ready to receive them as. So we have two women, Belicia and Lola, who are both described multiple times as being sexually desirable, and it almost becomes part of their own power attributes, the fact that they can hold their sexuality and wield it and in a way that creates strength for them. Specifically, we hear of Belicia's stories from her youth and her hyperbolic descriptions of her breasts and her body and the way that she's almost sort of mythically created as this beauty and sexual object from a young lover's standpoint, and she is almost too far advanced to function without being seen as a sexual object, and she uses this power sort of in a way to seek love, and she's had at least 3 different times in her life where she's been in love or seeking out love that have not worked out for her. And in contrast, Lola is described most physically by her legs and her hips, and I think at one time it said that when she wears shorts it could stop traffic or something to that effect. And Junior's always describing her physically in those sort of ways. And Lola's sexuality, she yields it as not so much a cry for love, but or a seeking out of love, but as a way to assert her individuality, and her strength is to move beyond where she is and to find a way out of this particular situation. This is a very, very interesting way of looking at it, because we might be sort of inclined to say that these women are victims of sexual objectification, which they certainly are to some extent, but their transition to individual power and strength is something that can be pulled out, I think, and especially if we look in contrast to how Oscar is lacking in those things. Diaz is playing with the ideas of femininity and masculinity and sort of pulling them apart based on their cultural construction. And that has to do with being in a new place, being in the United States versus being in the Dominican. How does that space allow for immigrants and diaspora to sort of deconstruct these constructs of gender and sexuality, and it's something that I think many, well, not many, but certainly critics have looked at in the novel and novels like this as a means of complicating the issue. Just a few more themes here. One theme that emerges, and it shows up in a lot of different ways, is this sort of absence of story or silent spots throughout in a lot of different ways it reveals itself, right? These gaps in the story. And we might interpret them as places for the readers to sort of make assertions about a particular scene or Junior's thoughts on that particular scene. Something else that I've seen pointed out about this is that Trujillo, the dictator from the Dominican Republic, would have prominently forbid records to have been kept. So record-keeping, storytelling, sort of officialdom of what has happened would have been kept for the state only and for a tight circle. And so to have sort of people's perspective or individual narrative as a component would have been against code or against the law even. So, and then also that we might look at these sort of forgotten moments or stops or pauses or gaps as places where the characters are purposefully forgetting or purposefully leaving out in order to shield themselves from some painful memories. Now, towards the end of the book, we learn about Oscar's in writing and in his chronicling of his events, and Junior's as well, and so we see a merger between the action of writing this book as a way to fill in those silences and to perhaps get at that idea of Oscar's sort of blank or silent insertion into a larger narrative, and Junior may be working to sort of attack that silence or that blankness of Oscar telling his story, sort of. The last one I have here is this idea of love and violence. I talked about this a little bit last week, but to extrapolate it a little bit more, we see that the two are often connected directly, and most especially in the presence of domestic violence or other extreme forms of violence, right? And just a few examples. Belly's love with the gangster from her youth is a story tinged with a lot of violence. Oscar when he loves Yvonne, and Abelard when he protects his daughter out of love. All of these sort of unhealthily mix the two emotions together, love and anger, as it exhibits itself in violence. Lola, on the other hand, experiences love and violence from her mother. She can't separate, her mother's love for her with the way that she treats her. And so this sort of creates, yes, a contrasting message, but also this idea that this is how these two things function together. And we see this in a lot of places during the novel. And it sort of comes back in some ways to the opening of the story about the fuku, the curse, the idea that perhaps all of these traumatic and unfortunate events have been laid out beforehand, and are all these events a result of this particular tinge on the narrative, and it just may be a fact of life in that sense. Of course, there's also, and I talked about this last time, the idea of the genre fiction emphasis, sci-fi and comics and fantasy and pop culture and the nerdiness of all these things being played with as a part of his identity. All of that is in there, and all of that contributes to the outsiderness and the need for Oscar's story to be sort of written into that space. A little bit longer than I wanted to, but I'll leave it at that. Feel free to write about any of those things or anything else that you see that you might want to connect to other books or other topics from this semester, and I will see you next week.